آزادی بیان
言论自由
free speech.
Mark Thompson, our seventh principle is we respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. Would you agree with that?
Yes, my view is that's the right place to end up. In other words, that the aggregate benefit of being able to freely debate beliefs and to look at the cut and thrust of the argument between beliefs is so great that although one would hope that in the broader sense that discourse happens in the context of respect for all of the participants, that respect should not extend, as it were, necessarily or in anything other than the sort of contingent way to the content of the belief. Though when we come to talk to religion, I think that raises some quite complex issues.
For example?
Well, I think one of the issues is that not all, but almost all the people who have religious belief are realist about the belief. In other words, that they believe that their faith refers to things which have an objective reality. And so, for example, they regard blasphemy as causing objective harm. So it's not just that a blasphemous statement or act would, in quotes, hurt their feelings or anger them because it went against their opinions. It would do actually objective harm, that offending or an act of sacrilege against the godhead or a religious figure actually creates harm in the world, as it were, and might be as heinous or more heinous than harm to a human being.
But a liberal, multicultural, open society can't accept that as its premise.
No, well, I think just so, but I think you have to be quite careful here. In other words, there isn't actually agreement between a secularist and someone of religious belief necessarily on the status of a speech act or a depiction, and whereas one might say, well, it sits clearly in the realm of one sort of expression, just like every other. For the person of religious belief, it might be much more weighty than that. And I think that the reason, although I do accept the principle you've outlined, I think you have to tread really quite carefully and sensitively, is because of the character. I mean, the point is that, you know, for a Muslim, a depiction, particularly a comic or demeaning depiction of Prophet Muhammad, might have the force, the emotional force, of a piece of grotesque child pornography. And one of the mistakes secularists make is, I think, not to understand the character of what blasphemy feels like to someone who is a realist in their religious belief.
But if you go that route, then you put, in a sense, the judgment in the eye of the beholder, in the subjectivity, the feelings of the person. I mean, suppose I said, I am mortally and profoundly humiliated and degraded by the statement that 2 + 2 = 4. Yeah. It sounds absurd, but we have no way of judging the one against the other. Yeah. In a sense, are you not giving what in American free speech jurisprudence is called the heckler's veto?
No, well, I want to say, I think, a couple of things about that. Firstly, I think, again, it's important to realise that religion as it is lived is not simply about a kind of interplay of propositions, 2 + 2 = 4 versus 2 + 2 = 5. It's a felt experience with a big emotional charge. And what I want to say is, to repeat, I think in the end, the aggregate benefit for me, in the end, means that freedom of speech wins, actually. I think there are, and we can come on and talk about examples, I think there's some complexity in there, but I think it wins. What I want to say, though, is that the kind of constraints that most people accept around racial hatred, the fact that it may be, in certain cases, certain forms of expression or certain forms of depiction may be outlawed because of the way in which they go to racial hatred and potentially the promotion and incitement of racial hatred. I think religion should never receive that level of protection or sensitivity, But I think it's wrong to imagine that it therefore goes into the general swim and that a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad is no more challenging than a debate about what 2 + 2 equals.
The BBC's editorial guidelines on religion say, I quote, "The religious views and beliefs of an individual, a religion or denomination must not be misrepresented or abused as judged against generally accepted standards."
Yes. It's one of those great phrases which... Well, my view about our guidelines is that they actually invite us the application of common sense and judgment, usually. And what that's implying to me is the knowledge that there's a boundary or a zone at which you're having to begin to weigh different qualities. So, for example, if we take a comedy which features religious figures or religious material, it's reasonable to ask whether the level of offence that's likely to be caused, as it were, in the name of making people laugh and entertaining them, is justified by the intended artistic expression involved versus the level of offence. And I think it's possible for a comedy to fail that test. There was an animated comedy the BBC had made called Pope Town, which, bluntly watching it, I and others judged in the end that the if you like, the creative ambition and indeed achievement of the piece didn't justify the level of offence that was likely to be caused by it.
Was it broadcast?
No.
One thing that was broadcast was J.S. Springer, the opera.
Yeah.
Tell us that very interesting story. First of all, when did it first come to your desk?
Well, Jerry Springer, at the opera, I'd been aware of for some years before it came to my desk. I'd heard about it being a great success at the Edinburgh Festival. It transferred to the National Theatre, where it began to garner not just very good reviews but awards, and eventually transferred to the West End. And indeed, I went to see it in the West End.
What did you think of it?
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And you didn't find it offensive as a practicing Christian?
I'm a practicing Catholic, and I would probably describe myself as a critical realist in religious matters, but I'm a realist. In other words, I believe that what, as it were, the truths of the Christian faith are objective truths rather than being an entirely subjective. I'm not, as it were, a Cupid-like figure. I was not in any way offended by the piece, even though, as it happens, I feel myself to be quite personally sensitive to mockery of religious images. I have, for example, I've never watched The Last Temptation of Christ, or I tend to avoid films or books which I think might upset me.
Has the BBC shown The Last Temptation of Christ?
It has been shown in the UK. I can't remember which broadcaster has shown it, and I'm not against it being broadcast.
Yeah.
The fact that I personally might decide not to watch a programme does not mean I don't think it should be broadcast. And indeed, I would always urge people, if somebody thinks they're going to find a programme offensive, the best advice you can give them is don't watch it. And The Life of Brian I've never watched. That has been shown by the BBC, and I would certainly defend our right to show it, and if I had to watch it for professional reasons I would, but as it happens I've chosen not to watch it. But Jerry Springer, I saw without feeling that it was offensive to me, because the intention of the piece was so clearly a satire about an American talk show host and his world, rather than the religious figures as such. Now, I readily accept that's a matter of opinion, but that was my view. But I went to see it not for a moment thinking it would come up as a point editorial decision, but our head of music, Peter Manura, thought it would be a good idea to put it on the air. Rowley Keating, who was then the controller of BBC Two, agreed, and so the plan was made for it to be shown on BBC Two. And understanding it will be shown quite late at night, quite careful warnings will be given to the public before it was shown, and so forth. When it became clear it was going to be shown, this was a piece of musical theatre which had now had very, very extensive outings in all sorts of different guises without any significant public protest, but a particular Christian movement, quite a small movement, Christian Voice, I think it's fair to say broadly evangelical in character, with some connections to what sounded like some quite tough-minded evangelical websites in the States, mounted a campaign for us not to broadcast Jerry Springer. And given the scale of the campaign, ultimately there was something like 60,000 complaints. And nowadays, the numbers, given the kind of mechanisation, the kind of machine gun character of the email, means that you sometimes have to take such numbers with a pinch of salt. But nonetheless, clearly I could look out of my office window and see people burning their licence plates outside the front door of the BBC. So it was clear there was quite a few people were unhappy with the idea we should broadcast it.
Did it come to your home? Did it come to the circle?
Well, a number of us in various ways were threatened. I mean, they put some private addresses on the web.
Did they find your home phone?
I received some phone calls from a chap called Stephen Green, who ran Christian Voice, and I had a number of, must be said, completely civilised conversations with him. Rowley Keating got a slightly more alarming set of messages, including a threat to, burn him and his wife and his children in their house, and so on. So there was some intimidation. I wouldn't for a moment argue that the majority of people who were upset about the idea of broadcasting it were people who were threatening violence, but there was a little bit of that and a little bit of menace in the air. And there was we had a security guy outside the door for a bit. But I looked at the programme. I mean, at this point, it seemed to be sensible to rather short-circuit things. I'm the editor-in-chief of the BBC, and I looked at the programme myself. It was very much that I remembered it from the theatre. I thought that it was a piece of, whatever you might think of its merit, manifestly an artistically serious and interesting piece of work. And the public should have the right to choose whether to watch it or not. And so we stuck to our guns. We made sure there were very careful warnings on BBC Two before it was broadcast. And to be honest, the moment it was broadcast, things got a lot quieter. The overwhelming majority of people who complained, of course, they complained not having seen it or being aware of its content, but on the basis of reports of what it contained, most of which have been almost entirely inaccurate, and once it was actually broadcast, the thing rather went away. But, I mean, I thought that was an example where I think you should be careful. I think religious figures of any major religion, if you're going to show them in demeaning circumstances, I think you need to ask yourself, to what end, as it were. This is not about, Tim, it's not about, in a sense, the curtailing of an argument. I mean, I don't think anyone ever really worries very much about, the sort of I put it to you, there is no supreme being stuff. I mean, the theoretical, in the world of the theoretical and ontological, the debate about, eschatology and whether there's a God or not, people don't worry about that. It's more about whether people's visceral response is such that you have to weigh that against other factors. In the case of Jerry Springer, I felt very strongly that the public's right, freedom of expression is not really about the freedom to express, it's about the freedom to hear and to listen and to experience. That very clearly militated transmission.
I watched it again the other night, and I was amused to notice that the Jerry Springer character says at one point, a person with less broadcasting experience might feel responsible.
It's a funny piece. It's a good and funny piece.
It's extremely funny. It's obviously satirising Jerry Springer and the whole cultural world. I mean, it's absolutely clear. But it is the case, isn't it, that the BBC wouldn't dream of broadcasting something comparably satirical if it had been the Prophet Muhammad rather than Jesus.
I mean, I think essentially the answer to that question is yes. I mean, it's worth saying that when I was controller of BBC Two some years earlier, we're talking now about the middle 90s, we broadcast a programme called Goodness Gracious Me, which was a sketch comedy programme made by a group of Asian writers and performers. Mira Sayal was one of them, for example, which had some quite strongly satirical material about all of the great religions of South Asia, including Islam. It was done, in a context which was itself encoded in, and it was really about different kinds of, I guess, South Asian immigrant groups, and in the end was really making fun of them rather than of the religions. But there were a number of moments where we got fairly large scale complaints about material, but because in a sense it didn't come to the attention of the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail and so on, it never got that larger explosive sort of cultural and moral panic moment which Jerry Springer did do.
But of course that was back then. What's happened in the meantime?
Post-Satanic Verses. So if this debate in broadcasting or in British cultural life suddenly got energised by the Satanic Verses, that was an absolute watershed, I think, for us. It was after that, but of course it was before 9/11 and the sense and Theo van Gogh and so forth, in the sense that some of this could lead to direct violence against individuals.
If your starting point is that the intensity of the feelings of those affected, then that almost invites...
Are a consideration, I think, and a consideration rather than a complete sort of joker that is played.
But it is an ace, isn't it? A rather nasty ace. If people say, "I feel so strongly about that. If you say it or broadcast it, I will kill you."
Well, clearly, it's a very noticeable move in the game. I mean, without question, I complain in the strongest possible terms is different from I complain in the strongest possible terms, and I'm loading my AK-47 as I write. There's definitely raises the stakes. But I think there's two or three things going on. So manifestly, solicitation or a threat to murder, which by the way is quite rightly a crime. It's a crime. Massively raises the stakes. And
what, if I may just interrupt for a moment, what other areas in your experience, your great experience as a broadcaster, have you experienced threats of violence, threats to murder?
Well, the coverage of Israel-Palestine and one or two other conflicts in the world can lead to, and have in my case led to, threats of violence, in other words, editorial decision making where someone's come to believe that you are not doing it fairly, or maybe likely not to do it fairly. I've been threatened once or twice in my career about one or two major conflicts, which have some of the same features: a sense of victimhood, a sense of conspiracy. Conspiracists who believe everyone else is conspiracists and so forth, and a sense of that the desperation of the circumstance means that the normal rules don't apply. But I also want to say, though, that the thing about religion, and I think it's very different to talk about Christianity in the United Kingdom, a very broadly, literally established, but also metaphorically established part of our kind of cultural built landscape. A religion which is actually, for all sorts of reasons, in many ways, a lot of our thinking about human rights comes out of a Christian tradition. I would arguably broad-shouldered religion, compared to religions which have a very, in the UK, have a very close identity with ethnic minorities, where it's not as if, as it were, Islam is randomly spread across the UK population. It's almost entirely a religion practiced by people who may already feel, in other ways, isolated, prejudiced against, and where they may well regard an attack on their religion as racism by other means. And although it would be nice for the argument to elegantly separate religion out and say, no, religion it's about propositions about belief, and it's got a different category. Again, at a kind of ontical level, it's completely bound up with identity, and in particular racial identity. And the idea that you might want to, not just for Muslims, but for Sikhs, Hindus, for Jews, Jews would be an interesting example here, I think, to think quite carefully about whether something done, in quotes, in the name of freedom of expression might to the Jew or the Sikh or the Hindu or the Muslim who receives it feel threatening, isolating, and so forth. I think those are meaningful considerations. They make the argument much more complicated, but that's how, in my experience, how it plays out.
I still wonder if you're not privileging too much two things. One, the subjective feelings of the person affected, and two, the threat of violence. Because it's a combination of those two things which makes the whole area of the portrayal of Islam so sensitive, isn't it? I mean, there are things that could be said about almost every other religion, I think it's fair to say. And certainly Hindus and Sikhs feel this. And some of them have said to me, well, why are people paying so much attention to Muslims? It's because they make such a fuss.
So it's said. It is believed. I think, in my view, wrongly that an arms race, and some Christians believe that, and certainly it was said extensively in the protests about Jerry Spring the opera that the point you made. Well, of course, it would never happen if it was about another religion, in particular Islam. Well, I think what I want to say is, I mean, you've heard me say that in the end, with Jerry Springer, I felt that freedom of expression and the right of the public to judge the thing for themselves was the trump card. That has almost always been my view. But I have a slightly different, perhaps I have a slightly different approach to this than your set of principles suggest, which is that I think there are multiple considerations that it's not unreasonable to ask what the consequences of broadcasting something or writing something will be for a particular individual or for a community, especially communities who may reasonably, I think that's an important word to use, reasonably take the thing to be an attack or to be threatening.
Could I just come in there, because it's a very interesting point. So what we have is a interlocking set of principles which have to be read together. Another one is we neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation.
Yeah.
And one of the worrying things about this area, specifically in relation to Islam, is a lot of people feel it is retreating in the face of violent intimidation.
Yes. They do, though. I think what's quite interesting, and I was looking at your at the principles. What's so interesting is that I think that to a Muslim and potentially also to a Christian, there are certain as it were quasi blasphemous things that could be said, which would themselves feel to them very like a threat of violence. So
for example, for a Christian.
I think there were some people who felt that about Jerry Springer the opera, that the depiction of Jesus Christ as an adult in a nappy is so utterly disrespectful of the Son of God that constitutes a kind of objective threat against or desecration of a religion.
But don't you think, Mark, that you have to hold the line at that? I mean, let me give you
a
comparison.
I think I did, actually.
Yeah, no, you did.
But I think what I'm saying, Tim, is I think it's a difficult line. It's not an easy line, and I think that the application of your principles is not quite as straightforward as the principles themselves might lead you to believe.
But the principles are only the starting point. It's clearly everything. The devil is not only in the detail, everything is in the application. But to give you another example, when Catherine McKinnon famously said, pornography is sex, which in a way is a functional equivalent of your statement about the blasphemous depiction. If one accepted that leap from the depiction, to, so to speak, the objective, to the thing itself, I think you're undermining the very foundations of free debate.
If you go as far as that, I think you would. But I don't think I do go as far as that. In other words, I mean, for example, I welcome the fact that one of the outcomes of Jerry Springer the opera was because a Christian Voice attempted to sue me, amongst other people, for the crime of blasphemous libel. the effect of that in the appeal court was ultimately to overturn the law of blasphemy for, perhaps not yet for books, but certainly for television, film and theatre. That's now essentially left our law. Well, I rejoice in that fact. I do not think that it's appropriate that there should be laws inhibiting freedom of speech in the interest of protecting religions. That doesn't mean, I think, necessarily you should publish or broadcast anything. And so firstly, the sense that in terms of whether these things should be, the civil power should be prohibiting these things, I would say absolutely not. I think it is also appropriate to say that editors, including my job as editor-in-chief of the BBC, should think quite carefully about these issues. And I would say that, so to that extent, I don't believe that blasphemy constitutes a crime like a crime of violence. I don't think, pornography, and presumably she meant almost criminal sex, forced sex or something. I don't think the two are the same. I think it is reasonable to ask, and every sensible person thinks quite carefully about what the likely consequences of any speech act are.
You raised a very interesting issue, which is that Islam, at least in the 90s and the last couple of decades, has been the religion of arguably a vulnerable minority in this country. And there's a distinction, in this country, obviously, not in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, and therefore there's a distinction between the vulnerable minority and the secure majority. Don't you think there are probably, in many cities in Britain, more actively practicing Muslims than Christians?
So I don't know that to be a fact, but it's very possible.
Certainly in Bradford, for example, and our society is clearly becoming so much more diverse that I wonder whether this way of thinking, which has secure majority, vulnerable minority, is not somehow being overtaken by a genuinely multicultural reality.
In the same way, in a way that the character of not everywhere in the UK, but in London, for example, of the way a kind of multi-ethnic society, and in particular the very high proportion of people amongst ethnic minorities of mixed race in this country, may also dilute, in a sense, some of the anxieties about racial identification. So in both cases, there are similar developments. These may become less pressing issues, and therefore the privileging, to the degree you do it, may become less important.
I mean, see, I think this is a really important point, that we have a whole way of thinking, which is about taking care about the feelings of vulnerable minorities, mainly as a result of mass migration. Now, in a city like London, we're getting so mixed up together. There's so many multiple identities that, in a sense, one has to go a step further and say there has to be a set of rules which, in principle, apply to all individuals.
Yes, though I think, and it may be that the UK, which is a remarkably secular society, the underlying, if you like, host culture is remarkably secular, one of the most secular cultures probably anywhere in the world. Nonetheless, I mean, I think it's an open question about whether that very strong background assumption of a kind of secular view of the world will stay at its current level, will take over completely as a kind of form of manifest destiny, which many secularists believe. We don't know. I mean, around the world, it would appear that if anything, secularism's rather in decline, actually.